It was a quiet evening in the small town of Ridgewood. The streets were dimly lit, and the occasional car drove past with little urgency. Officer Carter, a white police officer in his mid-30s, had been patrolling the area like any other night. His K-9 partner, Rex, sat alert in the back seat, his sharp eyes scanning for movement. Carter had worked in this department for years, and though his job often felt routine, he prided himself on being vigilant. Just a few streets away, General Maya Thompson, a black U.S. Army general, was driving toward her father's house. She had just finished a long day at a leadership seminar, where she was a keynote speaker. Maya was known for her calm demeanor and her ability to lead under pressure. Her career in the military was decorated with honors, and she was admired by many. Tonight, she looked forward to visiting her father, Charles Thompson, a retired FBI officer who had always been her rock. As Maya turned into her father's neighborhood, she noticed a police car parked at the corner. She didn't think much of it. Police patrolling quiet areas at night wasn't unusual. However, as her car approached, Officer Carter's patrol lights suddenly lit up behind her. Startled, Maya pulled over, her military training reminding her to stay calm and follow protocol. Officer Carter stepped out of his car, Rex following closely behind. He approached Maya's car, shining a flashlight through the window. Maya lowered her window and politely greeted him, explaining that she was visiting her father, who lived nearby. But something in Carter's demeanor changed. The officer seemed uneasy, his hand resting on Rex's leash. He asked for Maya's identification, which she promptly provided. The interaction was tense but civil until Carter's radio buzzed with a vague report of suspicious activity in the area. His instincts heightened, and his uncertainty grew. Carter, feeling pressured to act, signaled for Rex to stay close. The dog, trained to respond quickly, barked loudly, adding to the tension. Maya, trying to de-escalate, kept her hands visible and calmly stated her purpose. But Carter, perhaps misjudging the situation or feeling overwhelmed, gave the command that changed everything. In a flash, Rex lunged forward. Maya's calm demeanor turned to fear as she tried to protect herself. The chaos lasted only moments, but the damage was done. By the time Carter realized the mistake, Maya had been gravely injured. The silence that followed was deafening. Carter, visibly shaken, called for medical assistance, his hands trembling. Maya's last words were a whispered plea, "Tell my father." The neighborhood awoke to flashing lights and sirens as paramedics arrived. The weight of what had just occurred settled heavily over everyone present. Unbeknownst to Carter, the woman he had just encountered was not only a respected Army general, but also the daughter of a man whose name carried immense weight, Special Agent Charles Thompson. The story was only beginning. The morning after the tragic incident, the town of Ridgewood woke up to a storm of emotions. News spread quickly about what had happened during the quiet hours of the night. Social media was flooded with posts and comments, many expressing shock and heartbreak over the loss of General Maya Thompson. People couldn't believe that someone who had dedicated her life to protecting others had died under such circumstances. At the local police station, Officer Carter sat silently in a small room, his hands clasped tightly together. His mind replayed the events over and over, searching for a moment where he could have acted differently. His K-9 partner, Rex, sat quietly in his kennel, unaware of the consequences of his actions. The weight of the situation pressed down on Carter like a heavy fog. He was placed on administrative leave, a routine procedure after such an incident, but it felt far from routine to him. Meanwhile, Charles Thompson, Maya's father, was struggling to process the news. He sat in his home office, surrounded by photos of his daughter in her military uniform. Maya had always been his pride and joy, a symbol of strength and honor. Now, the thought of her being gone felt unreal. Charles, a retired FBI officer with decades of experience, knew the importance of staying calm under pressure. But this time, it was personal. As the day went on, the story gained national attention. News channels picked up the headlines. Decorated U.S. Army general dies in tragic incident with police K-9. Maya's face, smiling brightly in her official military portrait, was displayed on screens across the country. Her colleagues in the Army spoke out, describing her as a leader who inspired everyone around her. Protests began forming in major cities, with people demanding accountability and justice. Charles decided he couldn't sit idly by. Though he was retired, his skills and connections as a former FBI officer gave him the tools to start his own investigation. He made a call to an old colleague, asking for access to any information available about the officer involved. While he grieved for his daughter, he also felt a growing determination to uncover the truth. At the police station, tensions were high. The department faced mounting criticism from the public, and officers were divided. Some defended Carter, saying he had followed his training, while others questioned whether the situation could have been handled differently. The police chief promised a full investigation, but many doubted whether justice would truly be served. For Carter, the pressure was unbearable. He had joined the force to protect people, not to harm them. But now, his career and his conscience was under fire. He knew the coming days would bring difficult questions, ones he wasn't sure he had the answers to. As night fell, Ridgewood remained a town in turmoil. For Charles, the loss of his daughter was more than a personal tragedy. It was a call to action. And for Carter, the events of that night would haunt him forever. The story was far from over. The days following Maya's tragic death were filled with unanswered questions. Charles Thompson, a man known for his calm and calculated approach, buried his grief beneath a steely determination. He had spent decades uncovering the truth in his career with the FBI, and now he was using every resource he had to do the same for his daughter. Sitting in his office, Charles sifted through documents and news reports. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from Maya's colleagues, friends, and even strangers offering condolences. Despite the flood of emotions, he stayed focused. He began piecing together details about the night of the incident, starting with Officer Carter's record. He requested access to body cam footage, K-9 training reports, and any complaints against the officer. Some doors were harder to open than others, but Charles wasn't a man who gave up easily. Meanwhile, Ridgewood's police department faced intense scrutiny. The body cam footage was released to the public, showing the moments leading up to the tragedy. Opinions were divided. Some believed Carter had acted out of fear, while others argued he had overreacted. Protests grew louder, with people gathering outside the police station holding signs that read, "Justice for Maya," and "Enough is enough." Carter watched the news from his home, where he had been advised to stay for his safety. His wife tried to comfort him, but he remained distant, haunted by what had happened. He replayed the events in his mind, questioning whether his actions were justified or if he had been too quick to act. His K-9 partner, Rex, seemed oblivious to the turmoil, lying quietly by his side. Charles finally received a break in his investigation when a retired police officer contacted him. The man had once trained K-9 units and had serious concerns about the way some departments used them. He explained that while most dogs were highly disciplined, improper training or poor judgment could lead to disastrous results. This information confirmed what Charles had suspected. There were flaws in the system. Charles also uncovered troubling details about Carter's past. Though his record showed no major incidents, there were whispers of complaints that had been dismissed. Some involved minor claims of bias, while others hinted at poor decision-making under pressure. Charles knew this wasn't enough to prove intent, but it painted a picture of an officer who might not have been fully prepared for the responsibility he carried. At the same time, Maya's story began inspiring a movement. Her former military unit organized a memorial service, inviting the community to celebrate her life. They spoke of her bravery, kindness, and unwavering commitment to justice. Charles attended, standing tall despite his pain. He promised himself and the crowd that he would find the truth, no matter how long it took. As the investigation deepened, so did the divide in the community. People wanted answers, But those answers seemed more elusive with every passing day. For Charles, this wasn't just about finding justice. It was about ensuring no other family would have to face the same loss. Charles Thompson's investigation had reached a critical point. Every detail he uncovered seemed to bring him closer to understanding the truth about what happened the night his daughter, Maya, was killed. But one discovery caught him completely off guard. As he reviewed Officer Carter's service record, something familiar stood out. Years ago, during a joint FBI police operation, Charles and Carter had crossed paths, but they hadn't realized it at the time. Charles leaned back in his chair, the memory coming back to him. The operation had involved tracking a criminal network, and Carter, a young officer back then, had been assigned a minor role. Charles remembered the officer as quiet and eager to prove himself, but their interaction had been brief. Now, he wondered if that encounter had shaped Carter's perspective or added pressure that affected his judgment years later. At the same time, Charles' investigation revealed another critical issue: the training practices for K-9 units in Ridgewood's police department. Through his contacts, he learned that the department often cut corners in their training programs, focusing more on obedience than restraint. Rex, Carter's K-9 partner, had been flagged during training as overly aggressive, but the concerns had been brushed aside. Charles's research also uncovered a pattern in the department's deployment of K-9 units. Reports showed that the dogs were disproportionately used in situations involving people of color. It was a chilling realization that this wasn't just a tragedy. It was part of a systemic problem. Meanwhile, Carter was struggling with his own guilt and confusion. He couldn't escape the growing media coverage or the protests outside the police station. Every headline and every chant seemed to echo the question he asked himself daily: did I make the right call? Carter spent hours revisiting his actions that night. He thought about Rex's training, his own instincts, and the pressure he felt to respond quickly. He even remembered the joint operation with Charles years ago, though he doubted the FBI officer would recognize him now. The weight of everything was becoming too much to bear. While Carter wrestled with his thoughts, Charles was closing in on key evidence. A retired K-9 handler provided him with detailed reports showing how poorly managed Ridgewood's program had been. Charles also found eyewitnesses who had been too afraid to speak up before. Their testimonies painted a clearer picture of what had happened that night. As Charles pieced everything together, he couldn't ignore the larger issues at play. This wasn't just about one officer or one tragic mistake. It was about a system that allowed such tragedies to happen. Still, he remained focused on his ultimate goal: getting justice for Maya. With every step forward, the tension in Ridgewood grew. The protests were becoming larger and louder. Carter, feeling increasingly isolated, considered speaking out, but he knew it could make things worse for him. For Charles, the path ahead was clearer than ever. He was getting closer to the truth, and he was ready for whatever came next. The town of Ridgewood was no longer the quiet place it had once been. Protests filled the streets, with people from all walks of life demanding justice for General Maya Thompson. The signs they carried bore powerful messages: justice for Maya, accountability now, and stop the systemic failures. Charles Thompson watched from a distance, his heart heavy with both grief and determination. While the protests gave him hope, he knew that real change required action behind the scenes. Charles had gathered enough evidence to bring attention to the deeper issues within Ridgewood's police department. He partnered with a civil rights attorney, a woman named Elena Price, who shared his determination to fight for justice. Together, they filed a formal request for an independent investigation into the department's practices, focusing on the K-9 unit and Officer Carter's actions that night. At the same time, media coverage of Maya's death reached a national audience. News outlets replayed clips of her military achievements and interviews with her colleagues and friends. Maya's story became a symbol of the broader struggle for equality and accountability in law enforcement. Charles couldn't help but feel proud of his daughter's legacy, even as he mourned her loss. Inside the Ridgewood Police Department, the tension was palpable. Officer Carter, still on administrative leave, avoided public appearances. His neighbors whispered about him, and his mailbox was filled with angry letters. His family tried to shield him from the backlash, but Carter felt the weight of it all. For the first time, he began questioning not just his actions that night, but the system he worked within. Carter's wife encouraged him to speak to a lawyer, but Carter hesitated. He feared that any public statement could worsen the situation. Still, as the protests grew louder and the calls for justice intensified, Carter started to consider coming forward to share his side of the story. Deep down, he wanted to explain that he hadn't intended for things to end this way, but he also feared the consequences of admitting any fault. Meanwhile, Charles and Elena pushed forward with their case. They secured testimonies from other officers and former K-9 trainers who confirmed the systemic flaws in the department. They also uncovered documents showing that complaints against the K-9 unit had been routinely ignored. The evidence was mounting, and the case was gaining traction. As the legal battle began, Ridgewood became the center of a national conversation. News crews flooded the town, interviewing residents and activists. The protests outside the police station continued, growing larger by the day. Among the crowd were veterans who had served with Maya, standing in solidarity with her family. Despite the overwhelming attention, Charles remained focused. He knew this fight wasn't just about his daughter. It was about changing a broken system. He stayed up late most nights, reviewing evidence and preparing for the courtroom battle ahead. For him, this was more than a fight for justice. It was a way to honor Maya's life and ensure her death wasn't in vain. As the days passed, Officer Carter found it harder to escape the reality of what had happened. The once quiet life he had built in Ridgewood was now surrounded by protests, news cameras, and whispers from his neighbors. The media painted him as either a careless officer or a man caught in an impossible situation. No matter how it was framed, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed. At home, Carter spent hours in silence, staring at the empty leash that once held his K-9 partner, Rex. Rex had been temporarily removed from his care while the investigation continued. The house felt quieter without the dog's presence, but the silence only deepened Carter's guilt. His wife tried to comfort him, but even she struggled to understand what he was going through. One evening, Carter made a decision. He needed to speak, not to defend himself, but to acknowledge what had happened. With his wife's support, he arranged a meeting with his lawyer and the police department's public relations officer. Together, they planned a press conference. Carter wanted to address the public, even though he knew it wouldn't erase the pain or bring back General Maya Thompson. The press conference took place in a small room at the police station. Journalists packed the space, their cameras ready. Outside, protesters continued to chant, their voices echoing through the building. Carter stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he began to speak. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am," Carter said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "What happened that night was a tragedy, and I know no words can ease the pain felt by General Thompson's family and the community." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I made a decision in the heat of the moment. I believe I was acting to protect the public, but I now see that my actions led to a terrible loss. I wish I could go back and do things differently." Carter's words were met with a mix of reactions. Some in the crowd nodded, seeing his apology as genuine. Others remained skeptical, feeling it was too little, too late. The press conference ended quickly, but its impact rippled across the community. Meanwhile, Charles Thompson watched the press conference from his office. He listened carefully to every word, his face unreadable. While he appreciated the apology, he couldn't ignore the deeper issues that had led to his daughter's death. For Charles, this was only one step toward justice. The press conference brought renewed attention to the case. News outlets dissected Carter's words, and discussions about accountability and systemic reform grew louder. Carter, for his part, felt a small sense of relief. He had spoken his truth, even if it didn't change the outcome. As the legal battle moved closer to the courtroom, both Carter and Charles prepared for what lay ahead. The fight for justice was far from over, and the next chapter would test them both in ways they hadn't imagined. The day of the trial finally arrived, and the courthouse in Ridgewood was packed with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. The air buzzed with anticipation, and the town seemed to hold its breath. For many, this trial was about more than the events of one tragic night. It was about accountability and the hope for change. Charles Thompson entered the courtroom wearing a black suit, his expression calm but resolute. He carried a photo of Maya, one that showed her in her military uniform with a confident smile. For him, this trial was not just about seeking justice for his daughter, but also about shedding light on the flaws in the system that had allowed her death to happen. Officer Carter sat at the defense table, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. His lawyer had warned him that the trial would be tough, and he braced himself for the questions and accusations that would come. He felt a mix of guilt and fear, knowing that his actions would be scrutinized in front of the entire nation. The prosecutor began by painting a vivid picture of General Maya Thompson's life, her service to the country, and the devastating loss her death had caused. Witnesses took the stand to speak about Maya's character, her leadership, and her impact on everyone she met. Charles testified, his voice steady but filled with emotion, as he shared memories of his daughter and his determination to uncover the truth. The courtroom fell silent when the bodycam footage from that night was played. The video showed the moments leading up to the tragedy, including Carter's decision to release Rex. The prosecutor highlighted inconsistencies in Carter's actions and pointed to the flawed K-9 training program as a contributing factor. It was a powerful argument that left the jury deep in thought. Carter's defense team argued that he had acted according to his training and in the heat of the moment. They called character witnesses to testify about Carter's dedication to his job and his reputation as an officer. Carter himself took the stand, speaking about the split-second decision he made and expressing his remorse. "I never wanted this to happen," he said, his voice shaking. "I was trying to protect people, but I failed." As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom grew. The prosecutor focused on the systemic issues within the police department, using evidence Charles had uncovered about the K-9 unit's history and patterns of misconduct. It became clear that this case was not just about Carter, but also about the system he operated within. The jury deliberated for hours, their faces solemn as they reviewed the evidence. Outside the courthouse, protesters and supporters waited anxiously, holding their signs and chanting for justice. When the jury finally returned, the verdict was announced. Carter was found guilty of negligence, but the sentence was less severe than many had hoped. The decision left the town divided, with some feeling justice had been served and others believing it wasn't enough. For Charles, the fight was not over. While the verdict brought some closure, he vowed to continue pushing for reforms to ensure no other family would endure what his had. The courthouse was quiet after the verdict. The crowds that had once filled the streets slowly began to disperse. Some left with a sense of closure, while others walked away disappointed, feeling the justice system had fallen short. Inside, Charles Thompson sat quietly, holding the photo of Maya close to his chest. He had fought hard for this moment, but he knew there was still work to be done. Outside, reporters gathered around him, asking for his reaction to the verdict. Charles spoke calmly, his voice firm yet filled with emotion. This was never just about one officer or one decision. It's about a system that allowed a tragedy like this to happen. We've taken a step forward today, but we have miles to go. The weeks following the trial brought a mix of emotions for everyone involved. Officer Carter returned home, his career in law enforcement officially over. Though the court had been lenient in sentencing, he carried the weight of Maya's death with him every day. He often sat in silence, reflecting on the choices he made and the system that had failed to prepare him for such a critical moment. Carter vowed to work toward redemption, volunteering to speak about the importance of reform in police training programs. For Charles, life moved forward, but the pain of losing Maya never faded. He threw himself into his work, establishing the Maya Thompson Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating for police accountability and improving K-9 training programs nationwide. The foundation quickly gained attention, bringing together activists, community leaders, and even law enforcement officers who supported the need for change. Maya's story continued to inspire others. Her military colleagues created a scholarship in her name, helping young women pursue careers in leadership and public service. At the scholarship's first award ceremony, Charles spoke about his daughter's legacy, his voice steady with pride. Maya believed in justice, fairness, and the power of doing what's right. I hope her story reminds us all to stand up for what we believe in. Ridgewood, once a quiet town, became a symbol of change. The police department faced increased scrutiny, and several reforms were implemented, including improved K-9 training protocols and mandatory de-escalation training for officers. Though the process was slow, it marked a turning point for the community. Carter reached out to Charles months after the trial, writing a heartfelt letter. In it, he expressed his deepest regret and offered to support the foundation in any way he could. Though Charles hesitated at first, he eventually agreed to meet with Carter. Their conversation was tense but honest, both men acknowledging the shared pain of that night and the hope for a better future. As time passed, the memory of Maya Thompson remained a guiding light for those who knew her story. Her name became synonymous with strength, justice, and change. For Charles, the journey was far from over, but he found peace in knowing that his daughter's legacy would continue to make a difference in the world.